Your motorcycle isn't broken. It's betrayed. 860 bikers went completely silent. A 24-year-old stranger covered in road dust, bleeding from his knuckles, running from people who wanted him dead, had just said the 6 words that nobody in that compound had dared to say out loud. The most legendary Harley in Hell's Angels history sat cold and dead in the Arizona heat. And this kid, this nobody, was the only one willing to touch it. If you've ever been written off by everyone around you, keep watching. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And please subscribe so you never miss what happens next. The truck died like it had been waiting for permission. One moment, it was running, barely rattling, the kind of engine sound that mechanics recognize as a final conversation, and the next it simply stopped. No dramatic cough, no warning light, just silence and the smell of something cooked beyond saving, and the Arizona sun beating down on a stretch of highway that looked like God had forgotten to finish it. Ethan Walker sat behind the wheel for a long moment without moving. I was 24 years old. He had $43 in his wallet, a socket set in the truck bed, and 3 days of running behind him. His knuckles were split from a fight he hadn't started, and his left shoulder ached from a blow he hadn't seen coming. He had not slept in a real bed since Tuesday. He could not remember what Tuesday felt like. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. Then he got out of the truck. Not because he had a plan, not because he knew what came next. He got out because sitting still felt like surrender, and Ethan Walker had made himself one promise in the past 72 hours. He was not going to surrender, not to them, not to what they had done to him, not to the heat or the dust or the dead engine or any of it. He walked to the front of the truck, popped the hood, and looked at the engine the way a doctor looks at a patient they already know isn't coming back. He wasn't checking for solutions. He was paying his respects. "Yeah," he said quietly to no one. "I know." He let the hood fall closed. It was then that he heard it, a sound so massive and layered that it didn't register as motorcycles at first. It registered as weather, as something atmospheric. A low, rolling thunder that came from the south and kept building, and Ethan turned toward it because a man with nothing left to lose still has enough left in him to be curious. They came over the ridge in formation. Not a dozen, not 50, more, far more. A column of motorcycles so long that the end of it disappeared into the heat haze, chrome and black, and color flashing in the sun, exhaust notes layering over each other into something that vibrated in the chest. Ethan had seen biker gatherings before, a few from a distance, the way you see something impressive and understand instinctively that it isn't meant for you. This was not a gathering, this was an army. He stood next to his dead truck and watched them pass. Except they didn't pass. They turned. A wide dirt road opened up 200 yards ahead, and the column began feeding into it. Motorcycle after motorcycle, and beyond the road, Ethan could see the beginning of something vast. Tents and structures and trucks and what looked like a small city built in the middle of the desert. He hadn't noticed it before because he hadn't been looking. He'd been looking at his dead engine. He needed water. That was the thought that moved him, simple and biological and impossible to argue with. He had 2 half-empty bottles in the truck, and the temperature had to be over 105. And the nearest town, if he remembered the last highway sign correctly, was 19 miles back. He needed water, and there were people 200 yards away who almost certainly had some. He grabbed his socket set from the truck bed out of pure habit. He didn't even think about it. He locked the truck. He started walking. Nobody stopped him at first. That surprised him later when he had time to think about it. The perimeter of the compound, because that's what it was, a real compound with a rough boundary and a sense of territory that didn't need fences to be real, should have been the end of his walk. A man like Ethan, unknown, unaffiliated, uninvited, should have been turned around at the edge, asked who he was, asked what he wanted, sent back to his dead truck with nothing more than a bottle of water if he was lucky. But the men near the entrance were distracted. Ethan could hear it before he could see it, a different kind of noise from the motorcycle thunder, something tighter and more human, voices raised, an argument or close to one, the specific sound of a large group of people who are all upset about the same thing and taking it out on each other. He came around the side of a parked truck and saw the motorcycle. He stopped walking. He had seen expensive motorcycles before. He had worked on expensive motorcycles clients from Phoenix and Scottsdale, who brought him machines worth more than a shop lease and expected miracles on a Tuesday afternoon. I thought he understood what expensive looked like on a Harley Davidson. He did not understand this. It was a custom build that was clear from 10 feet away. Every component spoke to another component the way a great piece of music speaks to itself, each part aware of every other part. The chrome was a specific shade that came from plating choices that normal shops didn't make because normal shops didn't have access to the materials. The tank artwork was hand-painted, not decal, the kind of work where you can see the brushstrokes if you look close enough. But from any reasonable distance, it looks like a photograph. The engine and Ethan's eyes went there first because his eyes always went there first. The engine was modified in ways that he recognized as expensive and in other ways that he recognized as genuinely rare. He had heard about motorcycles like this the way people hear about things they'll never see, as legend, as story. He was looking at one, and it was surrounded by approximately 40 men who were in various stages of losing their patience with each other, and it was completely, utterly, absolutely dead. Nobody asked you to stand there. The voice came from his left, a man his age, maybe younger. Hard-looking, wearing a cut that identified him as a prospect. Looking at Ethan the way you look at something you're about to remove from a space. "I need water," Ethan said. "My truck broke down on the highway. I just need water and I'll go." "Then go get water somewhere else." "I would," Ethan said. "But the nearest somewhere else is 19 miles that direction, and I've been in this heat for 3 days, so if there's any chance—" "Hey," a different voice. Older, carrying the particular weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "What's he doing here?" The prospect straightened slightly. "Just leaving Bull. Lost driver needs water." The man called Bull was perhaps 50, with a face that looked like it had been left out in weather for most of those 50 years. He looked at Ethan with the kind of thorough assessment that takes about 4 seconds and misses very little. "What's in the bag?" Socket set. "You a mechanic?" Ethan paused. "Yes." Bull looked at him for another 2 seconds. Then he looked at the dead motorcycle. Then he looked back at Ethan. Something moved behind his eyes, not hope exactly, but the distant cousin of hope. "Come here," he said. "Bull," the prospect started. "I said come here," Bull was talking to Ethan. "Come look at something." "I really just needed—" "Water," Bull said. "Yeah, you'll get it. Come look at something first." Ethan came. The crowd around the motorcycle was not happy about a stranger walking into it, and it let him know. Not with words or not with many words, but with the kind of physical presence that communicates displeasure through proximity and stillness. Large men who had stopped moving, who had turned, who were watching. Ethan kept his eyes on the motorcycle. He crouched down next to it without asking permission. He wasn't sure if that was a mistake, but it was what his body did because his body was a mechanic's body, and it responded to a broken machine the way other people respond to a crying child. Something in him moved toward it. "When did it stop running?" he asked. "This morning," Bull said. 6 a.m., been trying to get it started for 4 hours. "Who's worked on it?" "Best 3 mechanics in the club." "What did they find?" "Nothing, that's the problem. Nothing obvious. Fuel system looks clean, battery is good, electrical checks out. She just won't fire." Ethan put his hand near the engine and held it there. Not touching, just near. He was feeling for residual heat for the specific pattern of how this engine had been running before it stopped. "Did anyone smell anything unusual when it quit, before it quit?" "Burning," said a voice from the crowd, "like something hot that shouldn't be hot." "Which direction, front of the engine or back?" Silence. "Then back maybe, top back." Ethan nodded slowly. He moved around to the intake side. He looked at it the way he always looked at engines he hadn't touched yet before he had an opinion, before he had a theory. Just looking, just letting what was there come to him. That's when he saw the dust. It was subtle enough that he understood immediately why the other mechanics had missed it. A fine metallic residue, the color of pencil shavings, settled in the junction where the intake met the carburetor. If you weren't looking for it, if you were looking for the normal categories of failure, electrical, fuel, mechanical, you would look right past it. It would register as road grime or ordinary carbon buildup, and you would keep moving. Ethan did not keep moving. He reached into his socket set, found a small flathead, and very carefully collected a sample of the dust on the blade. He held it up to the light. He moved the screwdriver back and forth, watching the way it caught the sun. Metal. Specific metal. Not iron, not steel. Softer than that. He sat back on his heels and let the thought finish forming. Then he turned and looked at the crowd around him. 40 men. Maybe more now. He couldn't see where the group ended. He found Bull. Has this motorcycle been out of your direct observation in the last 24 hours? He asked. Bull frowned. What kind of question is that? A specific one. It was in the transport trailer overnight. 2 prospects on guard. Were the prospects with it the whole night? Longer pause now. Bull looked at someone across the circle and Ethan couldn't read the look, but whatever it communicated made the other man's jaw tighten. What are you getting at? Bull said. Ethan stood up. He turned and faced the crowd fully, which was either a brave thing to do or a stupid thing to do, and he hadn't decided which. Your motorcycle isn't broken, he said. It's betrayed. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. 40 men. Then because word travels in crowds the way electricity travels through wire, more men. Pressing in, the silence spreading outward like a wave. Who the hell is this guy? The voice came from behind him. Close. He walked in off the highway, Bull said. His voice was carefully neutral. The voice of a man keeping himself very still while he decided something. He walked in off the highway, and he's telling us our bike was... The voice stopped itself. Get him out of here. Let him talk. A new voice, from further back. But this one had a different quality, quieter than the others, which somehow made it carry further. The voice of someone who didn't need volume to be heard. The crowd shifted, parted slightly. A man walked through it. Ethan had not seen many men who genuinely commanded the space they were in. Not through size alone, not through loudness, not through performed aggression. Genuinely commanded it the way the air in a room changes when certain people enter it. The way everything reorganizes itself around a specific center of gravity. This man was that. I was somewhere between 50 and 60, built like someone who had been physically hard for a long time and had stopped needing to prove it. A gray beard kept neat, eyes so dark they were nearly black, and the kind of still in them that came from having seen enough things that very few new things surprised him anymore. His cut said president. His face said he'd earned it by surviving things that other men hadn't. Jack Morrison, Bull said quietly, just loud enough for Ethan to hear. Like he was offering a piece of information Ethan might need. Jack Morrison stopped 3 feet away from Ethan and looked at him with those still, dark eyes. You're going to tell me what you found, he said, not a question. Yes, Ethan said. And then you're going to explain what you meant by what you just said. Yes. Jack looked at the motorcycle, then back at Ethan. You touched it without asking. I did. You know whose bike that is? Ethan had heard the stories. Most people in the Southwest had heard the stories if they moved in the right circles or worked on the right machines. A custom Harley built as a memorial, built over 3 years by some of the best custom builders in the country, completed on the 10th anniversary of a death that mattered to this club in ways that outsiders weren't supposed to fully understand. $2.64 million. Not as an investment, as a monument. I know what it means, Ethan said carefully. I wouldn't have touched it if I hadn't seen something. Jack Morrison looked at him for a long moment. The crowd around them had grown and the silence had grown with it, and in that silence, Ethan could hear his own heartbeat and the distant sound of the desert wind, and not much else. Show me, Jack said. Ethan crouched back down next to the motorcycle. He pointed to the intake with the flathead screwdriver, indicating the metallic dust without touching it. Aluminum shavings, he said, fine ones. The kind you'd produce if you were very carefully, very deliberately introducing material into an intake over a period of time. Not dumping it, introducing it the way someone would if they knew that a sudden dramatic failure would be noticed, but a slow accumulation wouldn't be. He moved to the fuel line junction. Fuel pressure is inconsistent. I can feel it from here. There's a slight vibration at rest that shouldn't be there. Something is partially blocking flow. Deliberately partially because a complete blockage is too obvious. He stood again, and there's scoring around the valve assembly. Microscopic. I haven't touched it yet to confirm, but from the visual, it's not wear pattern scoring. It's directional, like something was introduced to create friction, specifically on the intake valves. Silence. 3 separate points of sabotage, Ethan said, each one subtle enough to miss on its own. Together, they're designed to cause a failure that looks like a mechanical breakdown. Like the engine just gave up, when it didn't. when it was helped to fail. Jack Morrison had not moved, had not changed expression, was looking at the motorcycle with those black still eyes, and in them now was something new, something that hadn't been there before, something cold. "I need to ask you something," Jack said quietly. "Okay. And I need the true answer." "Okay." Jack finally looked at him again. "How do you know all that from 30 seconds of looking?" Ethan paused. For the first time since he'd walked into the compound, he let himself look at something other than the motorcycle. He looked at the crowd around him, the faces watching him, some suspicious, some curious, a few something approaching impressed. He looked at Bull, who was watching him with an expression that had shifted from assessment to something more careful. He looked at Jack Morrison, who was waiting. I thought about the shop in Phoenix with his name on the sign. He thought about the morning 6 months ago, when he had come in early and found it destroyed, not broken into, not robbed in the ordinary sense, but methodically dismantled. Records gone, equipment gone, and 2 police officers waiting for him with a warrant and charges that made no sense based on evidence that he knew had been manufactured, and nobody willing to hear that because the people who manufactured the evidence were the same people who owned enough of the right conversations that the truth didn't get much room. I thought about running, about 3 days of highway and heat, and a truck that finally gave up outside of nowhere, Arizona. He thought about the fact that the people who had done all of that to him knew where he'd been going, generally, even if they didn't know exactly where he was right now. They would find him. They always found people. That was the point of being the kind of organization they were. The finding was the message. He thought about all of that. And then he looked at Jack Morrison and said the simplest true thing he knew. Because I built engines like this one for 6 years, he said, and someone took that from me the same way someone tried to take this bike from you. The desert wind moved. Nobody spoke. Jack Morrison turned and looked at the motorcycle for a long time. The kind of look that isn't really looking at the thing in front of you, but at something behind it. At something the object represents that is larger than the object itself. When he turned back to Ethan, his expression had changed in a way that was hard to define, like something had been decided. Not announced, not explained, just decided in that quiet interior place where certain men make the choices that matter. "Can you fix it?" Jack asked. "Yes," Ethan said, "but I'll need to tear the engine down, partially at least. If those valve scores are what I think they are, I can't just clean the intake and clear the fuel line and hope. Something got into that engine and I need to find all of it before I rebuild." "How long?" Ethan looked at the sun, looked at the motorcycle, did the math that only someone who had spent years taking things apart and putting them back together in the middle of urgency could do. "How long do I have?" he asked. "The ride starts in 50 minutes, Jack said. "This motorcycle leads the ride. It has led this ride for 11 years. It doesn't not lead this ride." 50 minutes. Ethan looked at the engine again. The crowd watched him do it. He could feel their skepticism like weather, could feel the specific quality of doubt that 860 people generate when they're all doubting the same thing at the same time. He picked up his socket set. "Then I need everyone to step back," he said, "and I need someone to get me water, and I need whoever was on guard duty last night to come stand where I can talk to them." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Jack Morrison looked at the crowd and made a gesture with one hand. Nothing dramatic, just a small movement, and the crowd began to part. Ethan Walker got to work. I didn't think about the syndicate moving toward him somewhere on the highway. He didn't think about the charges waiting for him, or the men who'd burned his name down to ash in the community where he'd spent 6 years building it, or the fact that he had nowhere to go and nothing left except $43 and the tools in his hands. He thought about the engine. I thought about the dust in the intake and the pressure, inconsistency in the fuel line, and the directional scoring that meant someone had deliberately, patiently, carefully tried to kill a machine that meant something to people who didn't take the meaning of things lightly. He thought about what it takes to betray something that someone else loves, and he got to work. The first thing he pulled was the air cleaner assembly. 3 bolts quick, his hands already knowing the sequence before his brain consciously issued the instruction. What he saw in the carburetor throat made him exhale slowly through his nose. More aluminum particulate, and not just dust. Now he could see fragments, tiny but real, the kind that would have caused intermittent fuel atomization problems and over time valve damage that would look exactly like long-term neglect. This was not an amateur. Whoever did this understood how engines failed, understood how failure could be disguised. Who has access to the transport trailer? He asked without looking up. Bull, who had stayed close, answered. Prospects rotate guard. Officers have keys. How many officers? A pause. 7 full officers, plus Jack. And prospects, 6 on rotation this weekend. Ethan nodded. He reached deeper into the carburetor. Assembly fingers reading the surfaces, the way his fingers had always read surfaces, like a language he was born knowing. The person who did this was in that trailer at least twice, he said. Probably 3 times, once to introduce the material to the intake, once to effect the fuel delivery, and once more at some point before the engine was last run to do the valve damage. He glanced up briefly. They knew the maintenance schedule. They knew when the bike would be inspected and when it wouldn't. They knew how to stage the damage so it would show up exactly when it would cause maximum embarrassment and minimum ability to diagnose. The crowd that had stepped back had not gone far. They were listening. Ethan could feel it. Maximum embarrassment, Bull repeated slowly. For who? Ethan didn't answer that. Not yet. He had a theory, and he needed more of the engine in front of him before he said the theory out loud. Because a theory said out loud in a crowd of 800 bikers without enough evidence to support it was not a theory anymore. It was an accusation. And accusations had consequences. The valve assembly, he said instead. I need to get to it. I'll need help holding components, not mechanic, help just steady hands. And I need that water. Someone pressed a bottle against his arm. He drank half of it without stopping. He had not realized how thirsty he was until the water was in his mouth. And then his body made the realization for him urgent and insistent, and he made himself stop at half because he needed his hands steady, and drinking too fast in this heat would not accomplish that. He handed the bottle back. He went back into the engine. 47 minutes left. The valve assembly was worse than he'd feared and better than his worst case. The scoring was deliberate, that was now certain, confirmed by the direction and pattern of the marks, but it wasn't catastrophic. Not yet. The engine had been prevented from running before the damage reached the point of no return. Whether that was accidental or whether whoever sabotaged it had planned that too, had planned for the bike to fail spectacularly but not be destroyed, he couldn't say yet. He could say that the valves were still serviceable. Barely, but barely was enough. I need something, he said. Lacquer thinner if you have it, if not brake cleaner, and a small stuff brush, the kind you'd use for detail cleaning. And someone needs to get me the fuel line specs for this bike, the specific build, not stock. Custom builds run different pressure tolerances. Does anyone have documentation? A woman's voice from somewhere behind the inner ring of watchers. I have the build files on my phone, full spec sheet. Can you stand where I can see the screen? She moved forward. She was perhaps 45, dark hair, wearing a road captain patch. And she held the phone with the specific confidence of someone who knew that the information she had was valuable and was offering it freely because she decided it was the right call. What do you need? She asked. Fuel pressure tolerances. And if the builder documented any modifications to the valve, timing that too. She scrolled. Read to him. Ethan listened with the part of his brain that was not occupied with his hands, which was not a large part, but was enough, and the number she read told him something important. The fuel system had been set up with tight tolerances specifically for high-altitude desert running, which meant the partial blockage he'd felt would have produced failures at a specific RPM range, which meant whoever introduced the blockage knew the bike's specs. This was definitely not an amateur. 31 minutes. Ethan worked with a focus that was, in his better moments, almost peaceful. Not because this was easy, because this was the one thing in his life that had always made sense in a clear, honest way. Machines were straightforward. They had rules. They broke those rules only when something made them break. And if you were patient and honest and careful, the machine would show you what had made it break. Machines didn't lie. They didn't manufacture evidence. They didn't take the thing you built over 6 years and burn it down because they wanted what you had. The intake was clean. The fuel delivery with the partial blockage removed was steady. The valve assembly he worked carefully, breathing slowly, not rushing. The movements that required precision was cleaned and checked and confirmed serviceable. 22 minutes. The intake scoring on cylinder 4, he said. Does anyone have a mirror, small angle detail mirror? Someone passed him one. He used it to check an angle he couldn't see directly. What he saw made him exhale. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, what? Bull asked. Okay, it's going to run. He paused. But I need to tell you something before I finish. He sat back on his heels. He looked up. The crowd was very close now. He could feel the body heat of it, the specific pressure of hundreds of people in a circle. Whoever did this, he said, keeping his voice level, understood this motorcycle, not generally, specifically, the modifications, whoever did this, he said, keeping his voice level, understood this motorcycle, not generally, specifically, the modifications, the tolerances, the maintenance schedule, the timing of the ride. This was done by someone inside. The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier silences. This one had danger in it. I'm not telling you who, Ethan said. I don't know who. I know what was done, and I know what it took to do it, and I know that the person who did it believed that failing this ride would do something specific to someone specific. He paused. But the why isn't my part of this. My part is making sure this motorcycle leads the ride, and it will. He looked at Jack Morrison. Jack was watching him with those still dark eyes, and in them was something that Ethan recognized not from mechanics, not from engines, but from his own mirror in the months before he'd lost everything. The look of a man who has just learned that something he trusted has been turned against him, and who has not yet decided what to do about that, and who is holding himself very, very still in the meantime. Finish it, Jack said quietly. Ethan turned back to the engine. He had 19 minutes, and somewhere on the highway to the north, a car with 3 men in it had just taken an exit that would bring it within the hour to within striking distance of where he was kneeling. He didn't know that yet. He was thinking about the engine. He always thought about the engine. 19 minutes. Ethan's hands didn't shake. That was the thing about pressure, real pressure, the kind that has weight and consequence. It either breaks a person or it burns away everything that isn't essential. And what was left of Ethan Walker after 3 days of running, after 6 months of losing, after everything that had been taken from him, was essentially just hands and knowledge and the refusal to stop. He worked fast, but not careless. There's a difference, and it matters. Careless is speed without awareness. Fast is awareness compressed. Every movement had a destination. Every tool touched the right surface for the right duration and moved on. He wasn't performing confidence for the crowd around him. He genuinely did not have bandwidth for anything except the engine. Cylinder 2 intake valve, he said without looking up. Someone write this down. Light scoring longitudinal, consistent with particulate introduction between 3 and 6 weeks ago. Not recent. This was planned weeks in advance. Write it down, Bull said to someone behind him. Then quietly to Ethan, you said weeks. At least 3, maybe more. The ride is annual, always the same date. Then whoever did this started planning when the date was set. Bull was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped further. That narrows it. I imagine it does, Ethan said. Cylinder 3 looks clean. Moving to 4. He heard Bull step away. Heard him speak quietly to someone too quiet for Ethan to catch the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The tone of a man beginning to assemble pieces he didn't want to assemble. The tone of someone who already had a suspicion and was now being handed the evidence to confirm it, and who was not happy about being right. 14 minutes. The woman with the build files, he still didn't know her name, had stayed close. She hadn't spoken again after giving him the specs. But she was there, and he was aware of her the way you're aware of a steady light in a dark room. Not central, but useful. The builder, Ethan said. Is he here? Dead, she said. Flat. Not unkind, but flat. 4 years ago, this is the last thing he built. Ethan paused for half a second, just half, then kept working. What was his name? Richie Colt. She said it the way people say the names of the genuinely gone, with a specific weight that's different from ordinary grief. He built this over 3 years, said it was the most important thing he ever made. Why? Because of who it was for and who it was about. Ethan didn't push. He cleaned the cylinder 4 valve surface, checked the seating, confirmed the clearance was within the tolerances the spec sheet had given him. His hands told him the engine was almost ready. His hands almost never lied to him. It runs clean now, he said. The damage is contained. When she starts, she's going to run rough for maybe 30 seconds while residual particulate clears. Don't panic, don't kill the ignition. Let it run through. After that, she should be smooth. Should be, said a voice from the crowd. Skeptical, not hostile, just honest. Should be, Ethan agreed. I don't make promises about engines I've only had 19 minutes with. I make informed assessments. My informed assessment is that this motorcycle will run and it will run well. But I want whoever starts it to know about those 30 seconds. Jack starts it, Bull said. Always. Then Jack needs to know. I'm standing right here. Jack Morrison's voice came from directly behind him. Ethan hadn't heard him move. I heard everything. 30 seconds of rough, then smooth. Yes. What are the odds it doesn't start at all? Ethan thought about it honestly. He owed this man honesty, not comfort. 10%, maybe 15. There may be damage I couldn't access in this time with these tools. But 85 to 90% she starts. Jack was quiet. Those are better odds than I had 20 minutes ago. Significantly better. Ethan began reassembling. This part he could do faster than the diagnostic reassembly was mechanical memory hands, moving in sequences burned deep by years of repetition. Air cleaner, fuel line junction, intake bolts torqued by feel because he didn't have a torque wrench and feel was accurate enough if you'd done it enough times, and he had. 8 minutes. He stood up. His knees ached from the concrete. His shoulder, the one that had taken the hit 3 days ago, had been complaining quietly for the last 10 minutes, and he'd been ignoring it and would continue to ignore it. She's ready, he said. He said it simply, not dramatically, not like a man performing a moment, like a mechanic stating a fact. The crowd, which had been a constant presence at the edge of his awareness for the past 40 minutes, suddenly became something more than background. It became real to him in a way it hadn't been while he was working. He turned and looked at them for the first time since he'd crouched down next to the motorcycle. 800 people, give or take, maybe more, standing in something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite noise, watching him with the collective expression of people who want very badly to believe something and haven't decided yet if they're allowed to. And in the back of that crowd, at the far edges of it, a face that Ethan almost missed. Almost. I didn't know the man's name. He'd seen him once from across the compound when he'd first walked in, once standing near the transport trailer, when Bull had been asking about guard rotation, medium height, dark jacket, a cut that identified him as a senior officer, a full patch with a title below it that Ethan couldn't read from this distance. What he could read was the expression. He'd seen that expression before, not on a biker, on a business partner, the one who'd smiled when Ethan signed the lease on his second repair bay, and who had been, Ethan learned much later, already in conversation with the people who would eventually take that second bay and the first one and everything else. The expression of a person watching something unfold that they expected to go differently, who is recalculating in real time, who is trying very hard to look like they aren't doing that. Ethan looked away. He filed the face. He turned back to Jack Morrison. One more thing, he said quietly, low enough that the crowd wouldn't hear. Just Jack and Bull and the woman with the phone who was close enough to catch it. The person who did this is still here, Ethan said, in this crowd right now. And they just watched me undo what they spent weeks setting up. I don't know what they're going to do about that, but they're going to do something, because someone like that doesn't walk away from a failed plan without trying to manage the failure. Jack looked at him. You saw someone. I saw an expression. I don't know the name. Describe them. Ethan described what he'd seen. Height jacket, the officers cut the position in the crowd. As he spoke, he watched Jack's face, and he watched the specific moment when recognition moved through it, not surprise. Recognition without surprise, the kind that means the information confirms something already half believed. Jack's jaw set. Bull. Yeah, Bull said. He'd heard. Yeah, I see it. Don't move yet, Jack said quietly. Don't look. Let the ride start. Jack, let the ride start. The quiet authority in it was absolute. Not angry, not loud. Simply the statement of a man who had decided the order of things and was not negotiating the order. After the ride starts, we talk. Not before, not here in front of everyone. Bull nodded once, tight, unhappy, but he nodded. Jack turned to Ethan. The dark eyes were very still. You ready to find out if you were right? Yes, Ethan said. Jack Morrison walked to the motorcycle. The crowd didn't need to be told to make room. It made room the way water makes room, automatically understanding, without instruction, that something significant was about to happen. The circle around the motorcycle widened. The sound of the compound, the low, constant hum of 800 people, and their machines dropped. Not to silence, but lower, expectant. Jack stood next to the motorcycle for a moment. He put his hand on the tank, flat-palmed the way Ethan had seen people put their hands on the coffins of people they loved. Not grief exactly, something more complicated than grief. He reached into his vest pocket and took out a key. The key was worn, the kind of worn that comes from years of handling, not neglect. Someone had cared for this key the way people care for objects that are really memories. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up across the crowd, and for just a second his eyes found Ethan. Ethan gave him nothing, no thumbs up, no nod of reassurance. He just looked back because there was nothing honest he could add at this point. The engine would do what the engine would do. Jack put the key in the ignition. The sound of the compound dropped further, further until it was as close to silence as 800 people in a desert are capable of producing. Jack turned the key. The starter engaged. The motor turned over, once, twice, and then caught, and the engine fired, and it was rough, exactly as rough as Ethan had warned, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer, overlaid on a bass note that vibrated in the sternum. And for the 30 seconds that followed, Ethan counted them in his head, 1 and 2 and 3, watching the exhaust, watching the RPM, watching for smoke or the smell of something going wrong. And there was nothing wrong, nothing except the roughness, which was clearing, which by second 20 was noticeably smoother, and by second 28 was gone, and the engine settled into a sound that was... Ethan didn't have a word for it. He was not an emotional man by nature. He had spent most of his adult life in the company of machines which had suited him because machines responded to skill and patience rather than to sentiment. But the sound that came from that engine when it settled, when it found its rhythm, was something that even he could recognize as more than mechanical. It was a voice, specific, complete, itself. The crowd erupted. Not all at once in a wave, starting close and moving outward, the way reactions move through large groups when the thing they were waiting for finally happens. Shouting, engines starting around the compound in response like an answer, like call in response like a congregation. Someone behind Ethan clapped him on the back, hard enough to stagger him, and he caught himself and straightened and didn't say anything. Jack sat on the motorcycle. He sat there for a moment with his hands on the bars and his eyes closed, and in the noise and the chaos of 800 people responding to something that had been uncertain and was now certain, he was completely still, just feeling it, the way the engine ran. Then he opened his eyes, he looked at Ethan, and he nodded once. The specific nod of a man who does not owe anyone acknowledgement and is giving it anyway, which makes the nod mean more than applause. Ethan nodded back. That was when his phone buzzed. He'd almost forgotten he had it. The battery was at 11%, and he'd been conserving it, not checking it, not wanting to know what was waiting there because the things waiting there were not good things. He took it out now because the buzz had a specific pattern. 3 short, a code he'd set up with the one person who knew where he'd been heading in the general sense, even if not the specific. His cousin Danny, who lived in Flagstaff and who was the only family Ethan had left who still answered when he called. 3 short meant they know where you are, not approximately, specifically. Ethan stood with the phone in his hand and the crowd celebrating around him and the legendary motorcycle running its first clean notes in hours. And he thought about what 3 short buzzes meant. It meant the syndicate Carver's people, the men who had manufactured the theft charges and burned his business, and sent 2 men to his apartment with instructions that went beyond legal intimidation, had found him. Not narrowed him to a region, found him. An address or close enough to an address that the difference didn't matter. I thought about the road north, 19 miles to the nearest town. A dead truck on the highway, no ride, no plan, and men coming toward him who were not coming to talk. He thought about the fact that he was standing in the middle of 800 bikers who 40 minutes ago had not known he existed. He looked up. Bull was watching him. Bull had been watching him, had apparently been watching him the whole time, and whatever was on Ethan's face in that moment was enough. Bull moved toward him. What happened? Not a question. I have a problem, Ethan said. Separate from yours, but it's going to show up here. And when it does, he stopped. I didn't know this was going to happen. I didn't bring this here on purpose. I just needed water. Bull looked at him for a long second. What kind of problem? The kind that drives. Bull's expression didn't change, which was somehow more alarming than if it had. He turned and made a quiet gesture to someone at the edge of Ethan's vision. Then he turned back. How many? I don't know exactly, at least 3. Maybe more. Armed? Yes. How long? Phone message just came, so soon, an hour, maybe less. Bull looked at the celebrating crowd. Looked at Jack Morrison, who was still on the motorcycle talking to a group of senior members preparing for the ride that was now apparently going to happen. Looked back at Ethan. You just fixed the most important thing in this club's history, Bull said. You told us we had a snake in our house, and you were right. And now you're telling me you brought company. I didn't bring them, they followed. In my experience, Bull said slowly, the difference between those two things matters a lot less than people think. Ethan said nothing, because Bull wasn't wrong. But Bull said, and there was something in that, but something that shifted the weight of the conversation. A man who tells me the truth about a problem I didn't know I had is a different kind of man than a man who hides his problems and smiles. You could have fixed the bike and walked without telling us any of it. I know. Why didn't you? Ethan thought about it. Because you deserve to know, and because he stopped. Because I'm tired of people who take things and smile about it. I'm tired of the kind of person who breaks something from the inside and walks away clean. I didn't want to be that. Not even accidentally. Bull looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Something old and not without its own weight. Stay close to me, Bull said finally. Don't go near the perimeter. Don't go near the highway entrance. If someone you don't know tries to talk to you, come find me first. I'm not your problem to manage. No, Bull said, but you fixed something that mattered to a lot of people here, including me, and that counts. So stay close and let us figure out what we're figuring out, and if your problem shows up before we're ready, we'll deal with it. Ethan looked at him. I've been running for 3 days, he said. Not asking for sympathy, stating context. I can tell, Bull said. You look like hell. I feel like it. Then stop running. Bull said it simply, like it was simple. At least for the next few hours. It wasn't simple. Ethan knew it wasn't simple. The men coming for him were not the kind of men who would be discouraged by a large crowd. They were the kind of men who operated precisely because crowds looked the other way, because institutions looked the other way, because the machinery of normal life had been constructed to be navigated by people who knew which hands to put things in. A biker compound was not a sanctuary. It was a collection of people who had their own problems and owed him nothing. And yet, he thought about what Bull had just said. Stop running, at least for now. He thought about the engine. He thought about the sound it made when it settled, that specific, complete voice, and about the fact that he had heard that sound and been the reason for it, and about how that felt after 6 months of feeling like nothing he touched turned out right. He looked at Bull. Okay, he said. Okay, Bull said. He turned toward the celebrating crowd. First thing, you need to eat something. You look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday. I haven't eaten since yesterday. Close enough. Bull waved someone over. Get this man food, something real, not gas station garbage. A young prospect materialized with a plate. Ethan took it because his body left him no choice. The smell hit him, and his stomach made a sound that was almost embarrassing, and the prospect had the grace not to react to it. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd eating, watching. He watched Jack Morrison preparing to lead the ride, the way the senior members organized around him, the way the crowd responded to his presence without needing to be directed. He watched and cataloged the way he always cataloged, because observation was how he understood things, and he needed to understand this place if he was going to navigate it. And he watched at the far edge of the compound the man with the dark jacket and the officer's cut. The man was not celebrating. I was watching Jack the way someone watches a thing they expected to have already fallen. With the specific, frustrated stillness of a plan not going the way it was drawn. He was on his phone, Ethan realized. Had been on his phone, talking to someone or texting with the phone angled away from the crowd. Ethan ate and watched and said nothing, but he memorized the face. Because he had learned at significant personal cost that the people who smile while they're breaking things are eventually going to break something you can't afford to lose. And the only way to stop them is to see them clearly while there's still time before the damage is done. He was done not seeing them clearly. He was done with a lot of things. The motorcycle was running. The ride was about to begin. And somewhere on the highway, men who wanted him silent were getting closer. Ethan finished eating. He set down the plate. He looked at the road. Then he turned his back on it. The ride hadn't left yet. The formation was assembling. Ethan could hear it more than see it, the sound of hundreds of engines finding their idle, a low collective roar that moved through the ground and up through the soles of his boots. 15 minutes, maybe 20 before the column rolled, and in those 15 minutes the man with the dark jacket had moved twice. Ethan tracked him without appearing to. First move away from the outer edge of the crowd toward the cluster of senior officers near the transport trailer. Second move, a short conversation with a younger member, prospect maybe, or a junior patch that ended with the younger man walking quickly toward the highway entrance. Not the direction of the ride, the opposite direction. Ethan set down his water bottle. "Bull," he said quietly. Bull was 2 feet away talking to a road captain. He registered Ethan's tone and broke off the conversation without making a thing of it. "What?" "The man I described, dark jacket officer's cut. He just sent someone toward the highway entrance." Bull didn't look. That discipline, Ethan noted, was real. A man who'd spent years in situations where looking at the wrong thing at the wrong moment had consequences. "How long ago?" 90 seconds. "Which direction at the entrance? Left or right?" "Left, toward the main road." Bull pulled out a phone and typed something short. "Send it. Put the phone back." His face had not changed. His voice had not changed. "You're sure about the direction?" "Yes." "Okay." Bull finally looked at him, and what was in his expression was not alarm. It was the specific focused calm of someone shifting from one operational mode to another. "Stay where you are. Don't react to anything in the next few minutes, regardless of what you see." "What's going to happen in the next few minutes?" "Probably nothing visible," Bull said. "That's the point." He walked away, casually, greeting someone as he passed, stopping to say something that made the other man laugh. Moving through the crowd the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance, leaving no mark of urgency. Ethan stood where he was. "I thought about the car coming from the north. 3 men minimum. Carver's people didn't send fewer than 3, and they didn't send messengers. They sent finishers, men whose job was to close problems, and Ethan had been an open problem for 3 days, and open problems made men like Carver look incompetent, and Carver was many things, but incompetent was not one of them. He also thought about the man with the dark jacket, about the timing, about the fact that a senior officer of this club, a man who had spent weeks carefully engineering the failure of the memorial ride, had just sent someone toward the highway entrance minutes after a stranger arrived and fixed what he'd broken. Those two things felt to Ethan like they might be connected. He didn't know how yet. He was working on it. The woman with the bill's files materialized at his left shoulder. He'd noticed her drifting closer over the last few minutes without appearing to approach. She had a specific quality, watchful without being obvious about it, the kind of awareness that comes from years of being in environments where you couldn't afford to miss things. "You're still here," she said, not accusatory, observational. "My truck's dead on the highway," he said. "I don't have a lot of options." "You could have left it when the bike started. A lot of people would have. A lot of people don't have men coming for them from the north." She was quiet for a moment. "Bull told me." "How much?" "Enough." She glanced at him sideways. "My name's Diana. I'm the club historian. Richie was my brother." Ethan looked at her. The weight he'd heard in her voice when she'd said Richie's name earlier came back to him with context now. Not just a colleague, family. The man who'd spent 3 years building the motorcycle that Ethan had just spent 19 minutes saving. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "He would have liked you," she said. "He had a thing about people who could actually see engines, not just mechanics people who could see them. He used to say most mechanics are translators and a few are native speakers." She paused. "You're a native speaker." Ethan didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to do with that. "The man you're watching," Diana said even quieter now. "His name is Victor Kane. He's been the national VP for 6 years. Before that, Pacific chapter president for 9 years. He's been building something for a long time." "Building what?" "A case for why Jack should step down and he should step up." She said it flat without editorializing. "Most of it's been political. Club politics, the kind that runs on reputation and loyalty and who owes who what. The memorial ride it's not just a ride. It's the thing that reminds every chapter in America why Jack's leadership means something. If the ride fails, if the bike doesn't run, if Jack stands in front of 800 people and the engine won't start. She stopped. Victor would have had the argument he's been building toward for 2 years handed to him, wrapped up clean. And now he doesn't, Ethan said. And now he doesn't, Diana confirmed, which means he's pivoting, which means he's dangerous in a different way than he was an hour ago. Ethan thought about the younger man walking toward the highway entrance. Is there any reason Victor Kane would know about the people coming for me? Diana looked at him sharply. What? Is there a connection between Kane's operation, whatever he's built, whatever resources he has, and the kind of men who'd be hunting a runaway mechanic? Criminal infrastructure, money moving in directions it shouldn't. People who make problems disappear. Diana was very still. Why are you asking that? Because the timing bothers me. Kane just sent someone to the highway entrance, and the people coming for me are coming from the highway, and it's a long way to come on a coincidence. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one had the specific quality of a person rapidly reassembling things they thought they understood into a shape they didn't expect. I need to tell Bull something, Diana said. Tell him I think Kane may know who's coming, may have called them. She moved, fast but not running. The controlled speed of someone who understands that running attracts attention, and attention is a resource you spend carefully. Ethan stood where he was. He ran again in his mind. Carver's syndicate operated through legitimate business fronts, auto financing, fleet management, a few ancillary service companies. They were exactly the kind of organization that a man like Victor Kane, who'd spent 15 years building a power base inside a national club, would have contact with. Not because they were the same kind of criminal, because every power base needs infrastructure it doesn't own directly. Lawyers who don't ask questions, logistics, people who move things without manifests, financial channels that convert one kind of value into another. Carver provided that kind of service, which meant Carver knew Kane, which meant when Ethan Walker, former custom engine builder and current fugitive, walked into the Hells Angels compound and started fixing the motorcycle that Kane had sabotaged, someone had made a call, and the call had gone in both directions. Kane to Carver's people, he's here. Come get him. Carver's people to Kane, we're coming. Be useful. Ethan's stomach went cold. I thought about the young prospect walking toward the highway entrance, not to intercept Carver's men, to meet them, to bring them in through a side channel, to get them inside the perimeter before anyone knew they were there. He started moving before he'd finished the thought. Not toward the entrance, toward Bull. He scanned the crowd, found the shape of him, the particular way Bull held himself. Shoulders set, weight distributed, a man who stood like he was always slightly ready and moved toward it with the same controlled speed Diana had used. He was 10 feet away when the first shout came from the direction of the entrance. Not a threat shout, a surprise shout. The sound of someone encountering something they didn't expect and reacting before they had time to compose the reaction. Ethan turned toward it with everyone else in the immediate area, and what he saw was the young prospect coming back but not walking, running, and behind him the shapes of three men who were not part of this gathering and were not pretending to be. They'd come in fast, confident, the confidence of men who expected someone on the inside to manage the entrance, and whoever was supposed to manage it had either failed or panicked. Ethan stopped. He was between them in the center of the compound, between Carver's men and 800 bikers who did not know what was happening, and Jack Morrison on the legendary motorcycle preparing to lead a ride, and Victor Kane somewhere in the crowd recalculating what this meant for him. The three men stopped when they saw the crowd. That was the thing about confidence built on controlled environments. Remove the control and the confidence becomes liability. They'd expected to come in and find one man, a runaway. Outnumbered, isolated, frightened. Instead, they'd found a city. The tallest of the three wide shoulders, hands visible. The practiced stillness of someone who'd been in confrontational situations before scanned the crowd and found Ethan in approximately 4 seconds. They looked at each other across 40 feet of desert compound. Ethan had the strange crystalline experience of a moment where everything that had happened in the last 3 days condensed into a single point of clarity. 6 months of losing 3 days of running, 40 minutes of the most focused work he'd done since before everything fell apart. And now this 3 men who'd come to close the problem, and 800 people who had no idea he was the problem, and Victor Kane watching from somewhere, and an engine running clean for the first time in hours. He did not run. He had told himself he was done running, and he'd meant it, and when the moment came to confirm it, his body agreed. His feet stayed where they were. His hands were still. He looked back at the tall man across the 40 feet, and he did not move. That's him. The tall man's voice carried. Flat professional. Not loud, he wasn't performing for the crowd. He was communicating to his two companions. But in the way sound travels in a partially open space, it was loud enough. And 800 bikers have very good ears. The crowd shifted. It didn't part the way it had parted for Jack Morrison. It condensed. The way a body's immune system responds to something foreign, not by fleeing from it, but by moving toward it. Men who'd been standing with their backs to the entrance turned. Men who'd been in this conversation stopped the conversation. The quality of attention in the compound changed, and three men from outside its perimeter were suddenly the focal point of it. The tall man looked at the crowd converging, and for the first time something in his expression changed. "We're not here for any of you," he said louder now. "We're here for a man named Ethan Walker. He stole from our employer. We're just here to collect what's owed." Silence. Then Bull's voice from somewhere in the crowd, clear and unhurried. "He's under our hospitality." 3 words, that was all, but they landed with the weight of something institutional, something with decades behind it, something that meant more than the words themselves in this specific context. "Your hospitality," the tall man said. "He's a thief." "He fixed our bike," said another voice. Different direction. 30 minutes ago. "He's a criminal with charges filed against him in Maricopa County." "Charges filed by who?" Diana's voice now. And she had moved, was visible at the edge of the inner crowd, phone in hand, and her voice had a quality that was sharper than it had been in any of her previous conversations. "Filed by who? What lawyer? What date?" The tall man didn't answer that. "Because I looked him up," Diana said. 20 minutes ago while he was working. The charges are 6 months old. The business that filed them is a shell company. The lawyer who submitted the paperwork is currently under investigation by the Arizona State Bar. She paused. "So when you say he stole from your employer, I'd really like to know which employer that is." The crowd was very quiet. Ethan looked at Diana. She'd known. She'd been researching him while he worked quietly on that phone she always seemed to have in her hand, the habit of a historian who doesn't trust claims without documentation. She'd found what she'd found, and she hadn't said anything, had just waited to see if it became relevant. It had become relevant. "This isn't a legal conversation," the tall man said. His voice had tightened, the professional calm developing edges. "This is a collection matter, and we're asking you to step aside." "You're asking 800 people to step aside," Bull said, still unhurried. "That's a lot of asking." And then Jack Morrison's voice from the center of the compound, and every other voice stopped when it came. "What's happening here?" Not a shout. Jack didn't shout. But a voice like that carries the same way a ship's bell carries through noise, through crowd, through everything to the place it intends to reach. The tall man turned toward it. He saw Jack Morrison on the Memorial Harley engine, running 800 people between them, and something in the tall man's operational calculus changed in real time. Ethan could see it, the specific micro-adjustment of someone who has assessed his situation and found the margins much smaller than they'd planned for. "We came for one man," the tall man said, directing it at Jack now. "We have no issue with your organization." "You walked into my compound uninvited," Jack said. "That's already an issue. We were told we'd have access." He stopped himself, but it was too late. It was exactly too late, because 6 words spoken in front of 800 people don't unspeak themselves. And the specific 6 words he just said had a very clear implication about who had told him he'd have access. The crowd heard it, Bull heard it, Diana heard it, Jack Morrison heard it, and across the compound, Victor Kane heard it too, and Ethan, scanning the crowd with the part of his brain that wasn't occupied with the 3 men in front of him, found Kane's face at the moment of hearing it and watched what happened there. What happened was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The face went perfectly still and perfectly blank, in the specific way that faces go blank when the person behind them has spent years learning to control what shows. Not surprise, not guilt, not the ordinary human reactions. Just a wall coming up behind the eyes. Ethan had seen that wall before. He'd seen it on the face of his former business partner. The morning the police showed up, the morning that Ethan finally understood that the evidence had been manufactured and that the person who'd manufactured it had been standing next to him for 2 years smiling. The wall that comes up when someone knows they're about to be caught and switches immediately into survival mode. Who told you that you'd have access? Jack said. Not to Ethan, to the tall man, who inside this compound told you to come here. The tall man looked at him. The professional calm was almost entirely gone now. What was left was calculation, the raw, undecorated math of a man figuring out what the least bad option was. I want a lawyer, he said. You're not under arrest, Jack said. You're in my compound. That's a different situation. Jack, Bull's voice careful, let's do this right. We are doing it right, Jack said. Ask him again. The tall man's eyes moved across the crowd, left, right, looking for the exit that wasn't going to materialize, looking for the inside contact who was supposed to have made this manageable. Finding instead 800 people who had formed a complete perimeter without being asked to. He looked at his two companions. Something silent moved between them. Then he looked at Jack and said, Kane, Victor Kane, he called us this morning, told us the mechanic was here, said he'd make sure we could come in clean. The silence that followed was total. Ethan breathed. He'd thought it. He'd told Diana his suspicion, but hearing it confirmed out loud in front of everyone that was different. That was the sound of a thing becoming real that had only been a theory 60 seconds before. He looked across the compound at Victor Kane. Kane was already moving. Not running, he was too smart for running, too aware of what running looks like in a crowd, how immediately it tells everyone watching what they need to know. Walking, fast but not running, angled toward the far side of the compound, away from the highway entrance, and away from Jack toward the cluster of vehicles parked at the northern edge. Ethan said nothing. He didn't have to, because 5 different men in the crowd were already moving to intercept him, without instruction, without coordination, moving the way people move when they've understood something, and the understanding has an obvious physical response. Kane made it approximately 30 feet. Then he stopped because there was nowhere to go. He turned, and for the first time since Ethan had spotted him at the edge of the crowd, the wall behind his eyes dropped. Not completely, but enough. Enough that what was underneath was visible. And what was underneath was the same thing that had been underneath his business partner's face in that parking lot 6 months ago, and underneath Carver's face when Ethan had tried to explain what had happened to him, and underneath every face that had looked at him in the months since, as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be believed. Fear, and beneath the fear, something colder. The knowledge that the plan had collapsed in the secondary plans and the tertiary plans, and that there was no more road. Jack Morrison sat on the memorial motorcycle and watched Victor Kane run out of road, and his face was the face of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and does not feel good about finding it, which is the correct way to feel about betrayal. Not triumphant, correctly proportionately devastated, and then beneath the devastation, something solid. Something that would hold. Ethan stood in the middle of it all. Road dust on his clothes, grease on his hands, $43 in his wallet, a dead truck on the highway. 3 men who'd come to collect him being watched by 800 bikers who'd already decided what they thought of that. The tall man spoke again, and this time his voice had lost everything except fact. Kane told us the charges were solid, that the mechanic was running from a legitimate collection, and that getting him out of your compound before anyone asked questions was in everyone's interest. In whose interest? Bull said. His and ours. Kane had a deal with our employer. Has had one for 3 years. He said it without inflection, the voice of a man cutting losses. Our employer moves money. Kane provides cover, mutual benefit. 3 years. Ethan heard that and understood immediately what it meant. 3 years before this moment, which meant 2 years before he had ever encountered Carver's operation, which meant Kane had been connected to that world long before Ethan Walker had become a problem, and Ethan had simply had the misfortune of building something good enough that Carver wanted it, and Carver had the connection to Kane, and somehow in a way Ethan didn't have all the pieces of yet that connection had touched his life and taken it apart. I need to sit down, Ethan said, to no one in particular. Diana was next to him instantly. She didn't say anything. She just put a hand on his arm, steady, matter of fact, the way you steady someone who's been standing on uncertain ground for a long time and has just felt it shift beneath them again, but differently this time, in a direction that might possibly for the first time in 6 months be forward. Jack Morrison finally got off the motorcycle. He walked toward Victor Kane through a crowd that made room without being asked, and he walked with the specific deliberate pace of a man who is not angry, in the hot explosive way, but in the cold permanent way, and when he reached Kane and stood in front of him, he didn't raise his voice. 11 years, Jack said. 11 years I rode next to you. Kane said nothing. 11 years I trusted you with things that mattered to me. Still nothing. And you sat in that trailer, Jack said, in the dark, and you put your hands on Richie's bike. Something finally moved on Kane's face, not guilt, or not only guilt. Something more complicated. The face of a man who had told himself a story about what he was doing and why he was doing it, and had believed the story enough to act on it, and is now for the first time being required to see the story from the outside. I built something, Kane said, and his voice for the first time was not the controlled, managed voice of a man running a plan. It was the raw, unguarded voice of a man who has run out of plan. For 15 years, I built this organization, and you got the credit. You always got the credit. This isn't about credit, Jack said. It was always about credit. You put your hands on Richie's bike, Jack said again. Like the other thing Kane had said hadn't happened, like that specific fact was the one thing that couldn't be absorbed into any larger argument. That's what I keep coming back to. Out of everything, that's it. Kane looked at him, and in Kane's eyes finally something that might have been shame. Might have been. It was hard to tell from where Ethan was standing, and he had long since stopped trusting his ability to read shame on the faces of people who'd caused him harm. Bull appeared at Jack's shoulder. We need to make some calls, he said quietly. Local law, and some of our own people, the ones who handle. He stopped, glanced at Ethan, the administrative side of problems like this. Make them, Jack said. Bull nodded. He looked at the three men from the highway. You're staying, your car's being moved, you're going to answer some questions, and then we're going to figure out the appropriate next step. You're not in danger, but you're not leaving. The tall man looked at him for a moment, then he nodded. Because there was no other reasonable response to being surrounded by 800 people in a desert, and the tall man, whatever else he was reasonable. The crowd began to move again, the specific held breath quality of the last few minutes releasing not into relaxation, but into the different kind of energy that comes after a confrontation has resolved the energy of people processing what they just witnessed, talking, comparing what they saw from different angles. Ethan stood in the middle of it. Diana still had her hand on his arm. You're shaking, she said quietly. I know, he said. When did you last sleep? Tuesday. It's Friday. I know, he said again. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has made a decision that they're not going to announce. Come with me, she said. There's a trailer at the north end. Quiet. You can sit down somewhere that isn't the middle of all this. He started to say that he couldn't, that there were still things happening that he needed to be present for, that the situation wasn't resolved, that Carver's organization was larger than three men, and a connection to Kane, that the charges against him still existed on paper. Even if the paper was rotten, that sitting down in a quiet trailer felt like something he hadn't earned. He started to say all of that. Instead, he said, okay, because the engine was running, because Victor Kane had run out of road, because 3 days of running had brought him to a desert compound where the worst thing he'd expected was to be turned away without water, and instead he'd fixed something that mattered and told the truth about what he found and stood his ground when the men came and was still standing. Sometimes okay is the most accurate thing a person can say. He followed Diana through the crowd. Behind him, the memorial motorcycle was still running. He could hear it, that clean, complete voice finding its rhythm, doing exactly what it was made to do. He walked toward a few hours of sleep and didn't look back. He slept for 4 hours. Not well, not the deep restorative sleep of someone who has found safety. The shallow, fractured sleep of a body that has finally hit the wall it's been running toward for 3 days, where the mind keeps surfacing, checking, listening, verifying that the situation is still what it was when the eyes closed, and then sinking again because there's nothing left to run on. He dreamed about the shop, the sign above the door with his name on it, the smell of the place oil and metal, and the specific chemical note of brake cleaner that had been the background music of 6 years of his life. In the dream, the shop was whole and running, and he was in it, and it felt so complete and real that waking up was a specific kind of loss. He lay still for a moment after his eyes opened, looking at the ceiling of the trailer, letting the present reassemble itself around him. Arizona, a Hells Angels compound. Victor Kane under some form of custody in the compound he'd spent years trying to control. 3 men from Carver's organization answering questions somewhere on the property. The memorial ride he had slept through, the memorial ride he realized. He'd been asleep when 800 motorcycles rolled through the desert in formation behind the legendary Harley that he'd put back together with 19 minutes and a socket set. He sat up. His shoulder ached, his knees ached. His hands, when he looked at them, were still marked with grease that the quick wash-up before sleeping hadn't fully removed. He pressed his palms together and felt the familiar roughness of a mechanic's hands, the small calluses, the specific texture of skin that has spent years in contact with metal and oil. His phone was at 4%. He plugged it into the outlet next to the small cot someone had left a charger. He hadn't noticed that when he lay down and sat there for a moment listening. The compound was quieter than it had been. Not silent places like this were never fully silent. There was always engine noise, always voices, somewhere, always the ambient sound of a large number of people sharing space. But the specific tension of the morning was gone. The quality of the noise was different, looser, the sound of people on the other side of something difficult. The door opened. Bull came in without knocking, which Ethan suspected was standard operating procedure for Bull in most situations. He had 2 cups of coffee. He held one out. "Ride's back," Bull said. "Just got in." Ethan took the coffee. "How did it go?" 11 years of memorial rides, Bull said. This was the best one. He said it simply without performance. The bike ran like it was new, better than new. Whatever you did to those valves, I had 3 veteran mechanics look at it when it got back. They all said the same thing. What did they say? That it was running cleaner than it had since Richie built it. Bull looked at him. "You want to explain that?" "When you have particulate damage over time, the engine adapts, starts running compensations, timing adjustments, fuel mixture variations that mask the underlying problem, but also mask the engine's true capability. When you clear the damage completely and reset the system to spec, sometimes it runs better than it did before the damage started, because the damage was old enough that people stopped noticing it." Bull looked at him for a long moment. "You talk about engines the way some people talk about people." "Engines make more sense than people," Ethan said. "Today might be an argument against that," Bull said. He sat down across from Ethan on a folding chair that groaned under his weight. He drank his coffee. His face was the face of a man who has been managing things for hours and has arrived at a point where the immediate managing is done and the accounting begins. Kane is talking. Ethan looked up. "We have people," Bull said. "Legal counsel and others. People who know how to ask questions in ways that produce useful answers." Kane knows his position. He's not stupid. He knows that what happened out there this morning in front of 800 witnesses is not a situation with a favorable exit if he's difficult. Bull paused. "He's been talking for 2 hours. What's he saying?" "That the connection to Carver's organization goes back 3 years. That he introduced Carver to certain club-adjacent logistics channels in exchange for various things. Money, some of it. But more than money, information. Carver's people have reach into law enforcement, into county records, into the kind of bureaucratic infrastructure that a man building a political case finds useful." Bull's voice was even and careful, the voice of someone reporting facts that make him angry, and choosing not to let the anger into the voice because the anger isn't useful right now. "Kane used them. They used Kane. Standard arrangement. And I ended up in it because you built something Carver wanted. Kane says he didn't direct that, specifically says Carver's people spotted your shop independently. But when Carver was putting together the documentation to take your business, Kane provided the county records access that made the manufactured evidence stick." Bull met his eyes. "The theft charges, the falsified transaction records, the witnesses who confirmed a version of events that didn't happen. Kane's fingerprints are on the infrastructure of that, even if he didn't author it directly." Ethan sat with that for a moment. 6 months. 6 months of carrying the weight of charges he knew were false in a system that had no reason to believe him. And the thread that connected his destroyed life to this desert compound, to this morning, to this conversation was 3 years old. and ran directly through the man who had spent weeks carefully breaking the most important motorcycle in the club's history. There's more, Bull said. Tell me. Kane says he knows where the original documentation from your business is. The real documentation, your contracts, your financial records, your client files. Carver's people took them when they took the shop. Standard practice apparently take the records, so the target can't prove the alternate version of events. But they didn't destroy them. They kept them. Ethan went very still. Why would they keep them, he said. Leverage, Bull said. If you ever found a way to fight back, found a lawyer willing to listen, found a sympathetic ear somewhere in the system, those records could be used to muddy the water, to suggest your own documentation had been altered. Having them means having options. Bull looked at him steadily. Kane knows where they're stored. He's offering that information. In exchange for what? That's being negotiated, Bull said. But the negotiation is happening, which means the information exists and Kane knows it. And right now, Kane has a strong incentive to be cooperative. Ethan set down his coffee cup. His hands were not entirely steady. He noticed that and accepted it. Some information arrives in the body before the mind has processed it, and the body's response is appropriate even before the mind catches up. Those records were his life. 6 years of work documented. Client relationships. Engine builds. On the specific provable history of a business that had been real and legitimate and his before it was taken apart. Don't get too far ahead, Bull said. Not unkindly. This takes time. The right people have to be involved. The documentation has to be authenticated. There are legal processes. I know how it works, Ethan said. I've been watching it not work for 6 months. It didn't work because the people running it were connected to the people who broke it, Bull said. That's different from the process being broken. The process works when the people running it aren't compromised. He paused. We have a lawyer has worked with the club for 20 years. Seen situations like this before, maybe not identical, but the architecture is familiar. She's already been briefed. She wants to meet you. When? When you're ready. No rush today. Kane isn't going anywhere. Carver's people aren't going anywhere. The 3 who came in this morning are currently explaining their employer's operations to a very interested audience, and the more they explain, the more interested the audience becomes. Ethan looked at him. You're moving fast. We move fast when something's clear, Bull said. And this is clear. Someone came into our house, broke something sacred, used external criminals to do it, and tried to pin an innocent man into the middle of it. That's clear. When things are clear, speed is appropriate. He finished his coffee. Also, Jack wants to talk to you when you're ready, but he said to make sure you've eaten first. He said that. Jack is particular about people having eaten. Has been for as long as I've known him. Bull stood up. There's food in the main tent. Take your time. He left the same way he'd entered. No ceremony, just the door opening and closing. Ethan sat in the quiet of the trailer for another minute. I thought about the records, about what it would mean to have them back, not just legally, not just as evidence, but as a thing to hold. The physical proof that what he remembered was real, that the shop had been real, that the work had been real, that 6 years of building something hadn't happened only in his memory. I thought about how long he'd been carrying the specific weight of not being believed, not a dramatic weight, not the weight of disaster or violence. Those were real too, but they were acute. This was chronic. The persistent grinding weight of having the truth and no mechanism to make the truth matter. He got up. He found the food. He ate without tasting it, sitting at the edge of the main tent, watching the compound around him. The memorial ride had changed the quality of the crowd. You could feel it, the specific satisfaction of a thing accomplished, a tradition honored, a continuity maintained. People were relaxed in the particular way of those who've come through something. Laughing, telling each other what they'd seen from different positions along the route. The kind of collective processing that happens after shared experience. Nobody bothered him. A few people nodded when they passed. One older man stopped and said, "Good work this morning," without elaborating, and kept walking. That was all. Nobody performed gratitude at him. Nobody made a thing of it. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. Diana found him when he was almost done eating. She sat down across from him with her own coffee and a folder, an actual physical folder, the kind that seemed slightly anachronistic in the current decade, but which somehow suited her. She was the club historian, Of course she carried physical folders. "How are you?" she said. "Better than yesterday." "That's a low bar." "It's the bar I have," he said. She opened the folder. "I've been working since this morning. The documentation trail on your case it's messy on purpose, which means someone put effort into making it messy, which means there are seams." She turned the folder so he could see it. Pages of printed records highlighted in several colors with handwritten notes in the margins. "The shell company that filed the charges against you was incorporated 4 months before your business was targeted. That's planning. And the lawyer who submitted the paperwork I told you about the state bar investigation, but there's more. He's represented 4 other businesses in the last 3 years that had similar outcomes. Small shops, specialized services, owner-operators. All ended with the owner-facing charges, all ended with asset transfer to Carver-affiliated entities." Ethan looked at the papers. 4 others. "That we found in 3 hours of looking. There may be more." She met his eyes. "You weren't random. You were a type. Carver's operation had a model: identify independent, skilled operators with valuable assets and low institutional protection. People who don't have corporate lawyers or political connections. People who built something alone and are therefore alone when someone comes to take it." The specific coldness of that settled in him. Not surprised, somewhere underneath the chaos of the last 6 months, he'd understood that what happened to him had a pattern. You don't manufacture evidence that efficiently without practice. You don't navigate county record systems that smoothly without experience. He'd been a target because he fit a profile. "The 4 others, he said, "do you know where they are?" 2 are still fighting their charges through legitimate channels. 1 gave up, took a settlement, signed an NDA, disappeared. Her voice went careful. 1 is in prison, 18 months in. Charges that, she stopped. Charges that look, reading the documentation, very similar to yours. Ethan set down his fork. A man in prison for something Carver's organization had manufactured. While Carver continued operating, continued identifying targets, continued building the infrastructure of taking things from people who had built them alone. "Does he have representation?" Ethan said. "Not good representation, a public defender who was overworked and under-resourced and working from a record that had been systematically polluted." Dinah looked at him. "Our lawyer thinks there's grounds for an appeal. If the documentation from your case can be authenticated, if we can show the pattern across multiple victims, it changes the evidentiary landscape for everyone involved." Everyone involved, not just Ethan. Not just his shop and his charges and his 6 months of running, a man in a cell somewhere who'd been put there by the same machine that had come for him. Something shifted in Ethan's chest, not dramatically, not with the force of revelation, more like the quiet, specific shift of a man who has been thinking about one thing for a long time and is now for the first time thinking about something larger. "Tell your lawyer I'll talk to her today," he said. "Not when I'm ready, today." Diana looked at him, something in her expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition. The look of someone who has been watching a person figure out who they are and has just seen the answer arrive. "Okay," she said, "I'll set it up." She closed the folder. She started to stand. "Diana." She stopped. He looked at the folder in her hands, at the highlighted pages and the handwritten notes, hours of work done for a man she'd met this morning. "Why did you do all this?" She looked at him for a moment. "Because Richie would have," she said. "He had a thing about people who built things getting to keep what they built." She paused. "And because you fixed his motorcycle. And because," she stopped again. "Started a different way. I've been the historian of this club for 12 years. I've watched a lot of people walk through here. Most of them I can read pretty quickly. You walked in off the highway with nothing, and you saw something nobody else saw, and you told the truth about it, even when the truth was dangerous, and you didn't run when the men came." She looked at him steady. "I know what kind of person that is." Ethan didn't say anything. "Come find me in an hour," she said. "I'll introduce you to Margaret. That's the lawyer. She's terrifying and brilliant and exactly what you need." She left. Ethan sat with the remains of his food and the information that had just been handed to him, and the particular weight of understanding that his situation, which had felt for 6 months like a tunnel with no visible end, had just opened into something wider. Not resolved, not fixed, but wider. I was still sitting with that when Jack Morrison appeared. Jack sat down across from him without preamble. He was in different clothes than the morning the riding clothes traded for something simpler, but the weight of him was the same. The stillness, the specific gravity. Bull told me what Diana found, Jack said. It was fast work. Diana is always fast when something matters to her. Jack looked at him. She said you want to talk to Margaret today. Yes. Good. A pause. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it without being polite. Okay. What do you need right now? Not legally, not long term. Right now, today. What does Ethan Walker need? It was such a direct question asked so simply that it caught him off guard. He was so accustomed to questions that had agendas built into them. Questions that were really statements or requests or positions that a question with no architecture beyond genuine inquiry sat strangely. He thought about it honestly. My truck needs to be towed, he said. It's on the highway about 2 miles north. If I don't deal with it today, someone else will. He paused. And I need a phone charger that fits my phone for more than the couple hours this trailer one gave me. And he stopped. And Jack said, I need someone to believe in an official capacity with documentation that what happened to me happened. Before anything else. Before the lawyer and the appeal and the other victims. I need one person withstanding to put on paper that the charges against me are manufactured. He looked at Jack. Because right now I'm still technically a man running from a warrant. And everything else, the lawyer, the records, the appeal, all of it requires me to not be that. Jack was quiet for a moment. We have a contact, Maricopa County, former prosecutor, now private practice, specifically handles cases with documented evidence fabrication. He's been looking for a case with Carver's fingerprints on it for 2 years because Carver cost him something personally, and people who want something personally work harder than people who are just doing a job. He met Ethan's eyes. I was going to mention him after you'd eaten. You ate fast. Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. I was hungry. 2 miles north on the highway, Jack said. Someone will get the truck. It'll be in our yard by tonight. He stood. The Charger Bull can sort out. He sorts out everything. He started to walk, stopped, turned back. One more thing. Yeah, the mechanic who did the pre-ride inspection on the bike 3 months ago. He passed it clean, said everything was in order. Jack's voice was even. Kane had been working on it for longer than 3 months, which means either the mechanic missed something he shouldn't have missed, or he was told what to find and what not to find, Ethan said quietly. Yes. Jack looked at him. I need someone to go through that bike completely. Every system. Tell me what's actually there versus what someone wanted me to believe was there. Not today, not this week, when it's the right time and the right conditions. But I need someone who will look at it honestly. Ethan looked back at him. I'll do it. I know you will, Jack said. That's why I asked. He walked away. Ethan sat alone for a moment with all of it. The records, the lawyer, the contact in Maricopa County, the truck being retrieved, the motorcycle waiting to be fully known. The specific disorienting sensation of a life that had been reduced to $43 and a dead engine beginning carefully to expand again. He thought about the man in prison. 18 months. Charges built from the same architecture that had built his own. A public defender working from poison documentation. I thought about the 4 others, the 2 still fighting, the one who'd signed the NDA and disappeared carrying whatever they carried in silence. He thought about Carver's model, find the people who built alone because they fall alone. Find the independent operators, the owner-operators, the people with skill and no institutional protection. Take what they built. Move on. He thought about the fact that he had not fallen alone, not because he'd planned it, not because he'd been as strategic or clever or had seen any of this coming. He'd walked into a compound needing water and had fixed an engine because it was broken and had told the truth because lying about what he found wasn't something his body knew how to do. And now he was sitting here. His phone buzzed. 8% battery, the charger had given him something. He looked at the screen. A message from Danny and Flagstaff. Are you okay? The 3 men you told me about, they left their location 2 hours ago, and I lost track of them. Ethan typed back, they found me. It's handled, I'm okay. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then what does handled mean? Ethan looked around the compound. At the people moving through it, the ease of the afternoon versus the tension of the morning. the specific quality of a community on the other side of a hard thing. He looked at the tent where Diana was probably already on the phone with Margaret, the terrifying, brilliant lawyer. He looked at the direction of the highway where someone was already going to retrieve his dead truck. He typed, "I'll explain when I see you. Might be a while before I'm in Flagstaff." Things got complicated. Danny complicated good or complicated bad. Ethan thought about it. I thought about 19 minutes and a socket set. He thought about the sound of an engine finding its voice. He thought about 800 people going silent at once, and the specific words that made them go silent, and what it had felt like to say something true in front of a crowd that large and have it land the way truth lands when the ground is ready for it. He typed complicated good, first time in a while. He put the phone in his pocket. He got up. He had a lawyer to meet and a man in prison who needed what he was about to build. And the rest of it, the fear, the exhaustion, the 6 months of being the problem. Nobody believed was still there, would be there for a while yet, would require work and time and the slow accumulation of documented truth before it was fully behind him. But he got up, because getting up was the only direction that made sense, and he had always, even in the worst of it, known which direction made sense. He walked toward Diana's voice. Outside, somewhere in the compound, a motorcycle started. Not the legendary Harley, something smaller, someone heading out. But the sound of it moved through him, the way engine sounds always move through him, the way they had since he was 16 years old in his uncle's garage, learning to listen to machines the way some people learn to listen to music. He walked faster. There was work to do. Margaret Chen was exactly what Diana had promised. She was 61 years old. Small, with reading glasses, she took on and off with the specific rhythm of someone who had been doing it for 30 years and had stopped noticing. She had been in private practice for 14 years after 11 years as a Maricopa County prosecutor, and she carried the particular quality of a person who had spent decades in rooms where people lied to her and had developed as a result an almost physical sensitivity to the difference between a lie and the truth. She looked at Ethan across a folding table in a back room of the compound's main structure, and she spent the first 2 minutes not asking him anything, just looking, reading him the way he read engines, not for the obvious things, but for the things underneath. Then she opened her notepad. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Don't skip anything because you think it doesn't matter. The things people think don't matter are usually the things that do." Ethan told her everything. It took 40 minutes. He didn't perform it, didn't make it dramatic or shape it toward a conclusion. He laid it out the way he'd lay out disassembled engine components in order, each piece in its correct position, nothing hidden and nothing embellished. The shop, the growth of it, the client who'd come in 18 months before the end, the one he'd later understood was a scout, someone who assessed operations for Carver before Carver moved. The first signs that something was wrong, the morning he came in and found it gone. Margaret wrote without looking up, fast, precise shorthand that he couldn't read from across the table. "The 2 police officers who were waiting," she said. "Do you remember their badge numbers?" "No, but I remember their names, both of them." She looked up. "You're sure?" "I was paying attention," he said. "When something important is happening, I pay attention." Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile. "Most people don't. They're too scared." She wrote the names. "The Shell Company. Do you remember what it was called on the paperwork?" He told her. She wrote it. "And the lawyer who submitted the complaint. You said his name was Greer, Thomas Greer. He had an office on Camelback Road, Suite 412. Margaret stopped writing. She looked at him over her glasses with an expression that was for the first time something beyond professional assessment. "Thomas Greer on Camelback Road. You know him?" "I know of him," she said carefully. "He's been adjacent to 3 cases I've followed from a distance. Never as a primary, always one step removed. The kind of lawyer who keeps his name off the most important documents." She paused. "If he's directly on the paperwork in your case, that's a mistake. His mistake. People like Greer don't make that kind of mistake unless they were in a hurry or unless they thought the case would never be examined closely enough to matter." "They thought I'd run," Ethan said, "or give up." "Yes," Margaret said, "they usually do." She looked at her notes, flipped back a page, forward again. "The records Diana mentioned, Kane's claim about where they're stored. He said he knows the location." "I spoke to him an hour ago," Margaret said. Ethan looked at her. "You move fast." "I move at the speed the situation requires," she said. Kane is aware that his cooperation is the primary variable in what happens to him next. He's not stupid. He gave me a storage facility in Tempe, unit number, access code, everything. She took off her glasses. I have a colleague driving there right now. If the records are there, if they're intact, then what we have is a documented fabrication case with physical evidence, a cooperating witness at the officer level of the organization that orchestrated it, and a pattern across at least 5 victims that establishes not isolated misconduct, but systematic criminal enterprise. The room was very quiet. That's a different kind of case, she said, than a mechanic fighting theft charges. What does it mean? Ethan said. Practically. Practically, it means the theft charges against you get dismissed, not reduced. Dismissed with prejudice. It means the man currently in prison, I spoke to his public defender this morning. She's young and she's angry and she has been waiting for exactly this kind of development, gets an emergency appeal filed within the week. Margaret put her glasses back on. And it means Carver's organization gets a level of scrutiny it has not previously experienced, which is going to be uncomfortable for a number of people who have been relying on not being scrutinized. Ethan sat with all of that. I thought about 6 months of being the problem. Nobody believed, and then he thought about this room and this woman and the speed at which things had moved in the past 8 hours, and he understood that the difference wasn't luck. The difference was infrastructure. He had spent 6 months fighting alone, and alone meant no leverage, no reach, no institutional weight to bring to the truth. What had changed was not the truth. The truth had always been the same. What had changed was that the truth now had company. The records, he said, if they're intact, my client documentation, my financial records. Your business history, Margaret said. Yes. Authenticated and intact, they established the legitimate operation that Carver's people claimed was a front. They proved the alternate version of events. She looked at him directly. They prove you were telling the truth. He had known that. He had known the truth about himself for 6 months, and knowing it had been both everything and nothing, because truth without documentation in a system that runs on documentation is a very specific kind of powerlessness. He had known, and it hadn't been enough. Now it might be enough. He felt it in his chest, not relief, not yet. Something more cautious than relief. The beginning of allowing himself to believe that the ending he had been unable to imagine might actually be available. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, a number he didn't recognize. He started to dismiss it, and then something instinct or the specific attention pattern of someone who had spent months tracking unfamiliar numbers, because unfamiliar numbers were sometimes the warning he needed, made him answer. Mr. Walker, a man's voice, older official textured. My name is Detective Raymond Okafor, Maricopa County. I'm calling because I've been looking into a documentation fraud case for approximately 4 months, and your name appeared in my records this morning in connection with new information. I'd like to talk to you. Ethan looked across the table at Margaret. Hold on, he said into the phone. He put it face down on the table. There's a Detective Okafor from Maricopa County on the phone. Says he's been looking into a documentation fraud case for 4 months. Margaret did not look surprised. What she looked was satisfied in the specific way of someone whose read of a situation has just been confirmed. Raymond Okafor, she said. Yes, he's legitimate. Take the call. You know him. I know of him. He's been building something quietly. I didn't know how far along he was. She nodded at the phone. Take the call. Be honest. Tell him exactly what you told me. Ethan picked up the phone. The conversation with Okafor took 25 minutes. At the end of it, the detective said, I want to be clear about something, Mr. Walker. The charges against you have been on my list as potentially manufactured for 2 months. What I have now with Kane's testimony and the pattern Diana Colt documented this morning is enough to go to my lieutenant and request a formal case review. A pause. I can't promise a timeline, but I can promise that what you've described today will be taken seriously by people who have the standing to act on it. After 6 months of the opposite of that, the specific weight of it was considerable. Thank you, Ethan said. He meant it in a way that was hard to contain in 2 words but didn't have better words available. He hung up. Margaret was watching him. How are you doing? She said, not professionally, personally. I don't know, he said honestly. I think I'm still in the part where I can't completely believe it. That part lasts a while, she said. Even when it's real. She gathered her notes. I'll be in touch within 48 hours. If anything changes before then, If you're contacted by anyone you don't recognize, anyone claiming to represent Carver's organization or any affiliated entity, you call me first. Not the police. Me first. Okay. And eat something. You still look like you haven't slept enough. I slept 4 hours. Sleep more, she said and left. Ethan sat alone in the room for a moment. Then he went and found Bull because Bull was the gravitational center of this compound's practical operations. And Ethan had a question he needed answered. The 4 hours I slept, Ethan said when he found him. Did the ride happen the way it was supposed to? Perfect from start to finish, Bull said. 812 bikes. Longest column, 11 years. Jack led it on the Harley and the bike didn't miss a beat the whole route. He looked at Ethan. I needed to hear it again, Ethan said simply. I needed to hear it from someone who was there. Bull looked at him for a moment. You need to hear it again. After that, come find me. I'll tell you as many times as you need. Ethan nodded. He started to walk. Bull. Yeah. The man you had following Kane's outside contact this morning. The young guy Kane sent to the highway entrance. What happened with him? He's talking, Bull said. Has been for 2 hours. Mostly what he knows about Kane's external communications. Turns out he wasn't ideologically committed. He was financially committed. Kane was paying him. A pause. He's 22 years old. Made some bad decisions for money. Bull's voice went careful. Jack's handling that separately. Ethan thought about that, about a 22-year-old who'd made bad decisions for money and about the specific architecture of organizations like Carver's that were very good at identifying people who needed money and turning that need into leverage. He thought about the way systems of exploitation depended on participants at every level, not just the architects, but the people, the architects recruited by finding their pressure points. Okay, he said. He walked back into the main compound. I was standing at the edge of it, thinking about nothing in particular when he heard the motorcycle. Not the legendary Harley. He'd know that sound now anywhere had it filed in his memory the way certain sounds get filed permanently after a single meaningful encounter. Something else. A bike he hadn't heard before coming through the compound entrance and the sound of it wrong in a specific way that made the mechanic part of his brain surface immediately. He turned toward it. A road captain he hadn't spoken to directly was bringing a bike in slowly, a late model touring model riding rough. The kind of rough that starts as an intermittent issue and becomes a constant one over 100 miles of highway. The captain pulled up and killed the engine with the expression of someone who has been listening to something wrong for too long and is done pretending it's going to resolve itself. He looked at the captain. The captain looked at him. Looked at the grease still on his hands that hadn't fully washed out. You're the one who fixed the memorial bike, the captain said. Yes. You know what that sound was? Secondary chain tensioner, Ethan said. Probably. Could also be the cam chain, but the frequency pattern sounds like secondary to me. Either way, it's not catastrophic yet, but it will be if you put more miles on it today. The captain stared at him. Then he looked at the bike, then back at Ethan. I can look at it, Ethan said, if you want. I would very much want, the captain said. Ethan crouched down next to the motorcycle. His hands found the first access point automatically. His mind went quiet the way it always went quiet when there was an engine in front of it. Everything that had happened in the past 8 hours, Margaret and Okafor and Kane's testimony, and the records in Tempe, and 6 months of weight beginning to lift receded to background, and the engine was foreground, and that was right. That was exactly right. He worked for 20 minutes. When he stood up, 3 other people had gathered. One of them, he realized, was Jack Morrison. Secondary chain tensioner, Ethan told the captain. Like I thought, the adjuster screw had backed out. Probably vibration over time happens faster on high mileage bikes if the lock nut isn't torqued correctly. I've reset it and hand tightened for now. You need a proper torque wrench and a replacement lock nut before your next long ride. But it won't get worse today. Thank you, the captain said. It's not a hard fix, Ethan said. You don't take compliments easily, the captain said. I take them fine. I just don't need them for work that's straightforward. The captain smiled. First smile Ethan had seen directed at him all day that wasn't complicated by anything else, just genuine. What do you take them for? Work that isn't, Ethan said. He heard a sound behind him and turned. Jack was standing there, and next to him was someone Ethan hadn't seen before, a woman in her early 60s wearing a visitor's pass, holding a phone with a recording app running. She introduced herself as a journalist who covered motorcycle culture and club events, and she'd been present for the memorial ride, and she'd heard the story of the morning from approximately 15 different sources on the road, and she wanted to know if she could ask Ethan some questions. Ethan looked at Jack. Jack gave him nothing, just waited. What kind of questions? Ethan said. The true kind, the journalist said. I don't do hagiography. I don't do hit pieces. I write what happened. She looked at him steadily. What happened this morning is a story worth writing. A man fixes an irreplaceable machine in 19 minutes with a socket set, exposes an inside conspiracy, and gets tangled up in something much larger than anyone expected. That's the story. There are legal processes still in motion, Ethan said. I can't talk about some of it. I know what I can print and what I can't, she said. I've been doing this for 30 years. She looked at him. The part I can print, the mechanical part, what you found and how you found it, what it took, that's the part I want. I thought about it, about what it means for a story to be told by someone who writes what happened rather than what serves a purpose. About the 4 other victims of Carver's model, the 2 still fighting, the one silent behind an NDA, the one in prison. About the fact that systems of exploitation depend partly on the silence of the people they exploit, and that silence has its own architecture, and that architecture can be dismantled the same way any other structure can be dismantled if you know what to look at. Okay, he said, I'll talk to you, the parts I can talk about. She nodded, started asking questions. He answered them the way he'd answered Margaret, honestly, in order, without performance. And as he talked, he noticed something. The crowd around them had grown, not dramatically, organically, the way people drift towards something that sounds like it matters. Senior members, junior members, prospects. The road captain whose bike he'd just fixed. Diana standing at the edge, folder under her arm, listening with the specific attention of someone cataloging what she hears. He talked about engines, about what it means to see one clearly, about the difference between looking for expected failures and looking at what's actually there, about how sabotage works on a machine, the patience it requires, the specific knowledge of how failure can be disguised as natural decline, how something can be made to seem like it just wore out when in fact it was helped to fail. He realized partway through that he wasn't just talking about motorcycles. The journalist realized it too. He could see it in the way she was listening, the slight shift of someone who has come for one story and found it leading somewhere deeper. After an hour, she put down her phone. One last question. Okay. The plaque, she said. Bull told me about a conversation you had with Jack this afternoon, that he offered you something. Ethan glanced at Jack. Jack's expression was neutral. Whatever he'd told the journalist, he'd told her freely. He offered to help me open a new shop, Ethan said. Club resources, legal support, the framework to start over. And you said, Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about Montana, Jack had mentioned. Montana specifically had a reason for it that had to do with a club member's property, in favorable tax situation, in a region that needed a good independent motorcycle mechanic in a way that Phoenix with its established shops didn't. He'd thought about it during the conversation with Margaret and then during the phone call with Okafor and in the spaces between. I said yes, Ethan told her, but I asked for one thing first. What? That the shop takes referrals, he said. Specifically that if someone comes in who built something and lost it, who's fighting a system that was set up to make them lose the shop. Helps. Not just fixes their bike, helps. Connects them to Margaret. Connects them to people who know how to look at a documentation trail and find the seams. He paused. Because Carver's model works because people fight it alone, and a shop has relationships. A shop has a community that walks through the door. The journalist looked at him for a long moment. That's not a motorcycle repair shop, she said. That's something else. It's both, he said. She nodded slowly. She put her phone in her pocket. I'll be in touch when the piece is ready. You'll have a chance to review for factual accuracy before it runs. She left. The crowd that had gathered dispersed slowly. Jack stayed. They stood together for a moment without talking. Ethan had found over the course of this day that Jack was comfortable with silence, in the way that people are comfortable with silence when they don't need language to fill the space between themselves and the world. It was a quality Ethan had always recognized in people, because it was a quality he had himself. Montana, Jack said finally. Montana, Ethan said. Cold in winter. I grew up in Minnesota. Cold doesn't bother me. Jack almost smiled. There's a member there, Marcus. He'll get you set up the space, the utilities, the basic equipment to start. The rest you build. He looked at Ethan directly. It won't be what you had in Phoenix right away. It'll be smaller. You'll be starting over. I know. Does that bother you? Ethan thought about the shop in Phoenix, the sign with his name on it. 6 years of building it into something real. The morning it was gone, he thought about whether starting over after all of that was a wound or an opportunity, and he found somewhat to his surprise that the answer depended entirely on who was asking the question and when. Will she stay in this compound after this day? The answer was neither. The answer was simply the next thing. The next engine to understand the next problem to look at clearly, the next person who walked in with something broken and needed someone who could see it without flinching. No, he said, it doesn't bother me. Jack nodded. He reached into his vest and took out a card. He handed it to Ethan. Marcus's number. Call him in the next few days. He's expecting to hear from you. He paused. He also has a 1987 Sportster that's been running rough for 3 years and that 3 different mechanics have told him is beyond saving. Is it? I don't know, Jack said, but I'm looking forward to finding out what you think. He walked away. Ethan stood alone in the compound as the light changed around him. Afternoon moving toward evening, the quality of the air shifting the way desert air shifts in the late days, something cooling and clarifying in it. He could hear engines in the distance, the compound settling into its evening rhythm, voices and machines, and the particular hum of a large community finding its end-of-day pace. He looked at the card in his hand. Marcus's name and number. Montana. I thought about the records in Tempe, which Margaret's colleague had called about 20 minutes ago to confirm were they're intact, organized, exactly what Kane had described. His life's work in a storage unit in Tempe waiting to be reclaimed. He thought about Okafor in the formal case review and the man in prison whose public defender was young and angry and now had what she needed. He thought about the journalist and the story she would write, which would do something that documentation and legal processes couldn't fully do, put a human shape on a pattern of harm that had been operating in the dark. I thought about Diana, who had spent a day he hadn't asked for working on his behalf because her brother would have. He thought about Richie Colt, who had spent 3 years building the most important thing he ever made, and who was 4 years gone and whose machine was running clean tonight because a stranger had walked in off the highway and looked at it honestly. He put Marcus's card in his pocket. He found Diana in the main tent, still at her table, the folder open, a second folder, now beside it. She looked up when he came in. Margaret called, she said, records are confirmed intact. I know, she told me. How do you feel? He thought about it. Really thought about it the way he'd thought about Jack's question about what he needed with actual honesty, without the reflex to minimize or deflect. Like someone who's been carrying something heavy for a long time, he said, and just put it down, and my arms are still in the position of carrying it, but the weight is gone. Diana looked at him for a moment, then she closed the folder. That's very accurate, she said. That's exactly what it feels like. Has it happened to you? Once, she said, after Richie died, I carried it wrong for 2 years. Then I put it down. She paused. The arms thing goes away. Takes a while, but it goes. He nodded. Montana, she said. It wasn't a question she'd heard because Diana heard everything in this compound, and Ethan was no longer surprised by that. Good choice. Marcus is good people. Rough exterior good people. Richie liked him. That's a recommendation I'll take, Ethan said. She smiled. Real unguarded. The first fully unguarded smile he'd seen from her all day, and it changed her face in a way that made him understand how much of herself she'd been managing throughout this extraordinary, exhausting, improbable day. Get some rest, she said. Real rest, not 4 hours. I will. He walked out of the tent. He stood in the compound in the evening air. He could hear from somewhere near the center of it the sound of a motorcycle being started. Not a test start, not a mechanical check. Just someone heading out. The clean, settled note of an engine that knew what it was doing, moving from idle to road speed, fading as it went. He listened until he couldn't hear it anymore. Ethan Walker had walked into this compound 27 hours earlier with $43, a dead truck, and a life that had been methodically taken apart by people who believed that the things a person builds alone can be taken without consequence. He walked out of it with a lawyer, a detective, a journalist, and a phone number in Montana. He walked out of it with the knowledge that his records existed and would be recovered, that a man in prison would get a second hearing, that a pattern of exploitation had been documented with enough depth to dismantle it. He walked out of it with the memory of an engine finding its voice after someone had tried to silence it, and the knowledge that he had been the one to listen closely enough to hear what was wrong, and honest enough to say it out loud, and stubborn enough not to stop until the engine ran the way it was built to run. He had spent 6 months being told in every way a person can be told something, that what he built didn't matter, and what he knew didn't matter, and who he was didn't matter. One day in the Arizona desert had answered that. Not with speeches, not with ceremony, with a socket set in 19 minutes in the simple, undefeatable fact of a man who knew how to see things clearly and refused to pretend otherwise. Some people get one chance to prove who they really are. Ethan Walker took his. And the engine, the legendary, irreplaceable $2.64 million machine that had been designed to fail, ran clean all the way home.